And then we'll just. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for another session of Philly Talks Trash. We are dubbing this season 2, and it's entitled Participation is Power. We're so excited to have you all here tonight. And as I mentioned, I'm excited to see some old names as well as some new ones. So excited to get the message out there. And we invite you to share the word about our future sessions with others, and hope you enjoy tonight's program. We are hoping that some of you, that are returning from before, can kind of add to this discussion, and we're excited to loop the new folks in. For those that haven't been with us before, this is a joint project between the Plastics Reduction Task Force of Weavers Way Co-op, which is one of the member organizations or member groups from the Weavers Way Co-op. And we invite you to check us out. And then the other group as part of this is the Philadelphia Neighborhood Networks, a local group that's really focused on engaging people in Philadelphia on a number of local issues, including waste reduction. So there were a few of us that kind of overlap between these two groups. And the more that we got to talking, we realized how many issues there were around plastics and waste, overall, and that Philadelphia had so many of these issues that we really wanted to think more about. And the more we talked about it between our small group, we realized there were so many other people that would benefit from hearing about this, but that didn't know all of the information. So we decided to work on that. And that's when we decided to launch Philly Talks Trash. And so we've been hosting these webinars since January, really with a focus on how do we reduce our waste, how do we replace our throwaway culture, and how do we slow climate change. And so since January, we've done a number of different topics. We took a small break over the summer, and then we launched back up this past October when we focused on the most recent election. We're hoping that a number of you were able to join us, and if you weren't, we do have recordings of all of these past sessions, and we invite you to check them out. The one in October was really focused on the connections between the election and the environment, and we're hoping that for those of you that joined or listened, that it helped inspire you to go out and vote after that. And what we're hoping is that with the rest of this season, that we inspire you to act in the same way. We know that, it takes all of us to create positive change. And so that was part of the reason we entitled the second season, Participation is Power. We really hope to give you the tools and the inspiration to go out and participate in creating that change. And so we want to, with that, I want to kick off tonight's session. We've got a really great number of people joining us tonight. We're going to start with our guest speaker here, Christina Salento, who is speaking on behalf of Beyond Plastics. And then we've got our panelists, Megan Scholes from SEPTA and Jake Bransky from the Delaware River Basin Commission. And after that, we will have a lot of time for discussion and Q&A. So we would really invite you all to put your questions into the chat, and we will make sure to get to as many of those as we can. And then after we give you tons of information and facts, and both things that are working well and things that might not be working so well, we want to give you some tools on what you can do in your daily life to create change. And so we've invited Emily from Goodbye Supply to join us once again and give us some tips and tools on what we can do to reduce waste this holiday season. So with that, I want to kick things off with our first speaker. So Christina is joining us as a representative of the Beyond Plastics group. And for those of you that don't know about Beyond Plastics, I encourage you to check out their website. It's a local nonprofit, well, not a local nonprofit, it's a national nonprofit that's really focused on educating individuals and inspiring them to action. And so there's a number of opportunities to learn about plastics, the history of plastics, how it's kind of invaded our everyday life, and the impact it's having, and then ways for you to get involved and drive change in your own local communities. And one of the ways that they're doing that is through something called the Speakers Bureau, where they train volunteers to be able to speak about the history and the evolution of plastics in our communities. And so Christina has been trained as part of the Speakers Bureau and has agreed to join us tonight to share what she has learned and kind of, her experiences in this space. And I think she was inspired by, her continued actions in the environmental space way before she joined Beyond Plastics. And so, her interest in plastics really grew from the time that she had spent in Southeast Asia. And for those of you that haven't been abroad to see this, going to places like Southeast Asia or other parts of Asia, really kind of bring home the impact that plastic is having on so many communities that are so far from us, and how what we do here has such far-flung, implications for other cultures and other communities. And so it was in that space that she saw firsthand how plastics were impacting, other communities around the world. And since she's moved back to the US, Christina's been working at a nonprofit climate think tank to really think about advancing climate policy solutions. So with that, I want to turn it over to Christina. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We're excited to hear from you and to talk with you. I will turn it over now.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. I think that you explained that evolution in my kind of environmentalism and awareness about plastics probably much more eloquently than I even could have. So I really appreciate you doing that on my behalf. Saves me like a minute off of my presentation. Let me go ahead and share my screen for a second, and then I will dive in. I was asked to talk today about kind of the history of plastics pollution and where things are headed in the future. So the title of my talk is Plastics 101, How Did We Get Here and Where We're Going? And again, I'm here on behalf of Beyond Plastics. You can visit our website at the bottom there, beyondplastics.org. And we're really happy to be here. Thanks so much to the Philly Talks Trash team for hosting us. So just to kind of give you a little bit more color about kind of my background, as Kim mentioned, I'd really been an environmental advocate my whole life, kind of got my entrance into the plastic space as a very avid recycler. And of course, I know kind of all of the flaws of recycling as a solution to plastic pollution, but that was kind of my entrance into the field. And I learned a whole ton more when I moved abroad to Laos in Southeast Asia, and I lived there for 3 years, and I kind of saw firsthand the way that this culture of disposability that had originated in the United States and in the Western Hemisphere was kind of being exported across to all of these countries across Southeast Asia, turning cultures that had really relied on a history of reuse and sustainability for centuries, with things like wrapping food and other products in banana leaves and coconut husks, turn into a culture that really relied on plastics, and in particular, single-use plastics, as the norm. And I saw that all over Laos, and kind of made it my mission to address the plastic pollution issue in Laos, as well as kind of expand my horizons back here in the United States and be much more of a conscious consumer here, which is what connected me to Beyond Plastics. So once I kind of saw this question of how cultures become disposable, I was a little bit curious to explore that for myself in the United States. And so I looked into the history of how plastics really came to be the norm in our lives and how disposability became the predominant culture in American consumerism. And that took me back to the 1950s. So the 1950s were a period of really rapid social change in the United States. If you can kind of put yourself in that mindset, World War II had just ended. There was this huge boom in American manufacturing, and that boom really facilitated the growth of a lot of the products that we know and rely on today, kind of newfangled inventions like washers and dryers. And one of the products that really came into the marketplace in a really big way during that decade was plastics. Plastics were not invented in the 1950s. They were actually invented in the late 1800s. But it wasn't until this critical decade that they were really scaled up, in part because they had been used in the war effort. So you saw products like Tupperware kind of make their emergence on the American consumer scene for the first time. And even though Tupperware is kind of a household name for us now, that really was not the case at that point in time. Consumers were a little bit skeptical of Tupperware at first. If you can imagine growing up using really durable products like ceramic and glass, those things seemed a little bit flimsy. People didn't necessarily like the way that the plastic felt on their skin, felt a little bit oily. And so there had to be an intentional effort to kind of teach consumers to embrace these new plastic products. And at the same time that these more durable plastic goods like Tupperware were emerging, you also saw an emergence of the single-use culture. This is a really stark magazine cover or magazine feature within Life magazine in 1955 that kind of touted the glories of throwaway living, showing how disposable items could cut down on household chores. And this was a really effective marketing tactic. at a time when there was kind of this feminism movement emerging and kind of a growing need for women's liberation. And so that was something that was deliberately marketed toward housewives, was the ability for single-use products to cut down on the time that they spent doing things like washing dishes. The big switch in that kind of cultural mindset between reusable products and single-use products is one that we probably take for granted right now. We think that disposability is the norm. It's very common to just get a single-use plastic product and recycle it or throw it straight away. But when you think about this whole time period, it's really a mentality that had to be distilled in consumers. And that was an intentional effort on part of industry, was to teach consumers how to be disposable. So when I think of this time period, I think of my grandma, who was born in 1931 and lived through the Great Depression and 2 world wars, and was kind of becoming of age during this time period. And, she would tell me stories about how when she grew up, her mom would make her underwear out of, old curtains, and dresses out of like some parachute scrap that she somehow found in her yard. And so just thinking about that kind of cultural shift from a culture that really went from one of frugality and one of resourcefulness and really valued things like the milkman and reuse and return, over to being one that just kind of threw things in the air and said that it all was great. That was a really big shift, and it took a lot of effort. And that effort is probably best exemplified by this quote, which is a famous one in the plastic space. It's by Lloyd Stouffer, and he says, "The future of plastics is in the trash can." Lloyd Stouffer was an editor of Modern Packaging magazine, and he said this at a plastics industry conference in the mid-1950s. And what he meant by this was that there was a lot of money to be made in designing plastics to be disposable. If you think about going out and buying a product that is meant to last for years, like a Tupperware container, as opposed to a product that's designed to be used only once, you can make a lot more profit off of constantly requiring consumers to come back for the same product again and again. And so that was a deliberate shift in marketing, and it really began kind of a decades-long advertisement campaign to consumers to really tout the ways that plastics could cut down on chores, save them time, as well as increase kind of their health and safety, preying on some concerns around sanitation and things like that. And we saw a lot of those same tactics used in the COVID-19 pandemic as well. So the future of plastics is in the trash can. We heard that in 1950s. But I think what Lloyd Stouffer probably couldn't have anticipated is just exactly how right he would be about the fact that the future of plastics is largely in the trash can. So this is a stark graph. It shows all of the plastic waste that has ever been generated since the 1950s and going up to 2015. So this black line right here is all the plastic that's been created, and that little green bluish circle right there kind of points to the very small gap in between the amount of waste that's been created and the waste that's been discarded. So that red line represents waste that has really not been properly managed. It's just landed up in the trash can, in landfills, or in the natural environment. And that is the vast, vast majority of all the plastic that has ever been produced has kind of met that very sad fate. You can see that, much further down, a much, much smaller portion of plastic has been incinerated. That's that green line. And an even smaller portion has been recycled, which is that darker blue line. So looking at this graph, you're probably thinking that it would be great if plastics were only in the trash can. But we know actually that that is not where they are. It's really hard to keep plastics in any given place. And so that's why if you fast forward to the 2000s, you see plastics in a lot of places. The deepest points on Earth, the tallest points on Earth, the bellies of countless birds, the noses of sea turtles, and even in human placenta and breast milk. And so I say this not necessarily to bum you out, but to just sort of show you how stark the progression has been from just a few decades ago to present. And that definitely means that this is a very huge and scary problem. But in my mind, it's also potentially an optimistic story. When I think back to my grandma and I think about how this problem was basically manufactured in her lifetime, I also realize that it's completely possible to reverse that problem in the next lifetime. And just as consumers were taught how to be disposable, to kind of unlearn that behavior and revert back to a society where reuse is the norm. So that is the past and kind of the present. But I was also asked to talk a little bit about the future and kind of the direction that things are going in. Also, what about Pennsylvania? I don't think I mentioned this in my introduction, but I'm actually from the Lehigh Valley. So very interested in what this all means for PA. Well, the thing that we're seeing right now is that there's kind of a huge wave of anticipated growth in plastic pollution due to the expansion of the petrochemical industry, which is the industry that manufactures plastics. We're seeing that oil companies are increasingly interested in petrochemicals. They've increased their petrochemical operations, and petrochemicals are rapidly becoming the largest driver of global oil demand. And this is reported by the International Energy Agency, which is a fairly conservative international research group. This is directly because there's decreasing demand for fossil fuels in other sectors as a result of our kind of success in addressing climate change. Fossil fuel companies are seeing petrochemicals as an alternative for their products and a way to keep them relevant in the marketplace. And so you're seeing this with some business projections. Exxon, for instance, says that it sees plastics as a growing business. And if you look at this graph from BP, you'll see in this lower right-hand corner that they project decreasing demands for buildings and power when it comes to their oil growth. But that large bar on the left is the demand increase that they predict for plastics, so making up the vast majority of their anticipated demand between now and 2040. And this has shown up in a big way in Pennsylvania too. I mentioned that US oil companies are expanding their petrochemical operations. Shell has done that in Pennsylvania. I'm sure you all are aware of this. The new ethane cracker facility that opened in Beaver County a while ago and actually just began operations, I believe it was earlier this month or last month, is kind of an instance of the petrochemical industry looking to expand its presence in the Ohio River Valley region. And that's particularly salient for Western Pennsylvania, but it will also have implications across the whole state when you think about the infrastructure that's needed to support those operations, from extraction of natural gas to transport of natural gas to transport of the ethane, which is one of the raw building blocks for plastics, and then potential export abroad to other manufacturing markets internationally. So it's very much something that can potentially have a larger impact throughout the state and definitely really does need to be paid attention to. So with that, I want to shed a little bit of hope and talk a little bit about what you can do about all of that information locally as well as nationally, because Beyond Plastics is a national group and we do a lot of advocacy at the federal level. So first, I was excited to hear that you all were talking about elections because I think that policy is probably one of the greatest arenas for change. I would definitely let your elected officials know that you care about this issue. It's a little bit of a limbo time politically right now because we're approaching the end of the year. We're waiting for new elected officials to come in both federally and at the state and local levels. But it's kind of never too soon. At the federal level, there's a piece of legislation that we really love. It's called the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. It's been introduced for the past 2 Congresses, and we hope that it might be again in the 118th Congress, which is the one that's coming up. So we all know we have a new senator here in Pennsylvania. You also have your House of Representative. So feel free to reach out to them and let them know about your support for this legislation. Beyond Plastics and other groups have a lot of materials that you can use to do so, like suggested language and letters and things of that nature. And then at the state and local state and local level, we also know that there's a lot of opportunity for political change with a new governor coming in. And some changed politics within the Pennsylvania state legislature. So definitely be keeping an eye out for advocacy opportunities on state and federal policy moving into 2023. And one of the best ways to stay attuned to all of those policy opportunities is to affiliate as a local group of Beyond Plastics. This map here shows all of the local groups that we have across the country. And it's a really great resource and network of organizations that are really dedicated to working on plastic pollution and to work with each other to do so. There are 2 ways to create a local group. You can either register an existing group, or you can create one as an affiliate kind of underneath the Beyond Plastics umbrella directly. And with that, you would be in the know of all of the events that are going on with Beyond Plastics, the various trainings that we're doing, and all of the actions that we're organizing, so that you get kind of first stab at getting involved within this great advocacy network that we've established of advocates all across the country. One step to becoming a local group is to do an online training, but these trainings are also open to anyone. I have taken them myself. I thought I knew a lot coming in, and I actually ended up learning really a ton throughout the process of doing those online trainings. So if anything that we discuss here today is interesting to you, you might want to kind of deepen your knowledge with some of the sessions that we have coming up in February. I wish the next one was sooner, but we actually just wrapped one up last week. So this session will give you kind of all you ever wanted to know about plastics, and then also delve into some of the really effective local advocacy and activism techniques that we use with our network all across the country. And the link for that is at the bottom. It's beyondplastics.org/trainings. And if you're interested in a local group, it's beyondplastics.org/local groups. That link is there at the bottom of that page. So with that, I think I've gone probably a few minutes over, and I will stop it there. But you can feel free to reach out to me. That's my personal email, as well as my Twitter handle at the bottom. Would be really happy to carry on the conversation with any of you. So thanks so much.
Christina, thanks you so much. That was so informative and both depressing and enlightening and wonderful. So thank you. I connected in so many different ways to what you were saying. I actually think I probably came to this space in a similar way, and where I was very devoted to recycling and was like the avid, recycling person in my house growing up. And then I remember a few years ago, like learning about what was really happening, and I just felt like heartbroken. It was a lot to handle. And actually that's when I ended up connecting with Beyond Plastics. So I really do recommend anyone that's interested, as one of the options of ways to get involved, really think about the Beyond Plastics network, which is really wonderful and a good way to just learn more about what's happening. And then you can get involved locally. And obviously, we're two organizations here, and then there's many others, but I think there's so much to learn from what you were saying, and so many ways in which plastic has kind of infiltrated our daily life. And I love the connections that you made to climate, and kind of those bigger conversations. And I think that's exciting to put those pieces together. I also want to encourage folks, and we can add a link either tonight or in our follow-up email. There was a really great Senate subcommittee hearing this morning, and it was all about the plastics reduction bill that Christina had just mentioned. And it was like a really great conversation and way to hear, what's happening in DC on this issue and how we have to keep pushing. So I would encourage folks to watch that as well, both to get a flavor for kind of both what the plastics industry is saying, but also, what advocates are able to push for. So another avenue to learn. So, the reason we brought Christina on tonight was to give you all a historical basis for how we got to where we are and where we are now with plastics and how quickly they've been infused into our everyday lives. And we do see that they are everywhere. And unfortunately, we see them not only in things that we're using, but how they're littering almost every space in our lives. And so, as we were thinking about that issue of plastic waste, we really wanted to get really local on that and think about, what's happening in Philadelphia and this area, and how plastic waste has affected so many of these spaces that are really important to our everyday lives. And that goes from everything to our homes, to public transportation systems, to our waterways, to every space that we're using and that we need. And so we wanted to invite some other local experts on to tell us more about these issues and what's happening in these spaces. So we've invited 2 additional panelists on tonight to talk more about the connections to how plastics infiltrated our lives kind of on the local avenue, but also, what organizations and entities are doing kind of in that space to create positive change. And I think that there's both of those balances in these conversations. So we're going to begin with Megan Schulz, who is the Corporate Sustainability Initiatives Manager at SEPTA's Office of Innovation. Some of you may also recognize her as one of the participants and winners on Jeopardy back in 2019. Clearly, I found this very exciting. But going back to Megan's current role and connection to tonight's talk, I assume that everyone on here is familiar with SEPTA. It is the 6th largest US transit system by ridership, moving people all around southeastern Pennsylvania. And it's an incredible feat that, we move so many people around, but obviously that also leads to a lot of environmental hurdles and challenges. And Megan has worked really hard to confront those challenges. She led implementation of SEPTA's Enterprise Energy Management System and serves on its Zero Emissions Bus Working Group. She has more than a decade of experience in this space and in terms of environmental sustainability and compliance. And we're super excited to have her with us tonight. So with that, Megan, I want to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Kim. I was going to say you have a really good memory if you remember Random Person on 2 episodes of Jeopardy! 3 years ago. Although SEPTA did promote the heck out of it, you won't be surprised to learn. Good evening, everyone. My name is Megan Schultz. As Kim said, I work for SEPTA's Office of Innovation. I'm a sustainability manager. I'm delighted to be invited. I have a couple of slides introducing our sustainability mission. Not a lot specific about plastics, but some, especially when we interact with the public, our passenger spaces and passenger waste and recycling. But I'm excited to start this partnership and would like to participate more in the future. So whenever I'm asked to represent SEPTA's sustainability program, I always start here. SEPTA is inherently sustainable. Our business is getting people around with using the lowest amount of resources possible. Depending on the mode that you take on SEPTA, you are probably about half as carbon intensive as if you're driving yourself in a car. And this is actually improved because our electric vehicles, the grid is greening in southeastern Pennsylvania with more renewables added, and we are replacing our old diesel buses with diesel hybrids. So the numbers are actually better than they used to be. So we can't lose sight of whatever else SEPTA does, we have to keep delivering reliable, safe service for our ridership, because that is the single biggest thing we do to contribute to environmental sustainability on the local level and on the global level. So one of the themes of our sustainability program in general is that we don't have a budget for it. We are cash strapped, as are a lot of transit agencies, and SEPTA is in particular underfunded compared to our peers. So one of the principles of our sustainability program is everything we do has to be budget neutral or bring in revenue. And the good news is there's a lot of environmental and sustainability actions we can take that do fit that description. So I'm highlighting 2 categories here. Our solar power portfolio has been a gigantic success. We have 3 solar rooftops, and breaking news as of December 1st, we have 2 offsite solar farms in central PA and Franklin County. And between them, they avoid about 20,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year, as well as generating income or savings for SEPTA to the tune of about $1 million since we started operations in 2020. So going to waste and recycling and resources, we actually recycle a lot of what we use on the operations and industrial side. Specifically, anything that we can either recycle for free or anything that is a revenue stream. So the big guns here are our waste oil and antifreeze that comes out of our vehicle maintenance shops. Those have been a revenue stream for many, many years, being recycled rather than being disposed of. Our scrap metal program, of course, scrap metal is always profitable and we go through a lot of it, as well as we have a print shop where all of SEPTA schedules and signage and stickers are printed. And so all of the paper, the waste paper that comes out of that print shop is also recycled at a profit. We're always on the lookout for more as well as markets are changing. Specific to this presentation, I wanted to mention our participant as a citizen of Philadelphia with the city of Philadelphia. They have done for many years a litter survey or litter index. It's called different things, litter report, where folks go out throughout the city over the period of about 6 months, and they gather data based on locality about the state of the litter on the street or in facilities there. And SEPTA is a big partner for that. We send our employees out into our stations and they take pictures and they rate the stations. There are other big participants such as Philadelphia Parks and Rec and the Philadelphia School District, and also community volunteers. And I threw a screenshot in here of the latest report I could find, which was data from 2017. This was actually put on hold in the pandemic, but I recently heard that the city is going to be restarting it, collecting data in calendar year 2023. So SEPTA will certainly participate that, and y'all can look out for that next year. I'll mention challenges facing us. I mentioned funding and personnel. We can really only do projects where it makes economic sense for us. So that definitely constrains, of course, when the market of the recycling market fell out a couple of years ago. Of course, we used to send all our municipal recycling to China, and then China decided they didn't want it anymore. That was definitely a setback for us. And I'll also mention specifically to Philadelphia, gathering passenger waste from stations, depending on where you are in Philadelphia, unfortunately, sometimes they are contaminated with used needles and sharps, which unfortunately means that they cannot be recycled, and sometimes means they cannot even be processed safely by our waste processors. We have to bring in a specific contractor for that. So there's definitely challenges to improving our waste and recycling situation. So as far as a call to action and what you can do, I have to say the most important thing that you can do is ride our system. Every time you ride, you're cutting your carbon footprint, and you're also generating fair revenue for SEPTA, and you're showing our taxpayer base and our funders that we are a useful system and that folks in Philadelphia want better transit. Christina finished her excellent presentation with a call for civic engagement, and I have to say the same for transit. SEPTA gets most of our funding from the state legislature of Pennsylvania, which can be difficult sometimes because I don't know if you know this, but the state legislature of Pennsylvania is gigantic and mostly rural. So we have to prove our value to the whole state as a necessity for the economic engine that is Philadelphia. We need good transit to be able to get around effectively. I put a website here, planning.septa.org, that hosts all of SEPTA's planning and sustainability efforts, as well as details about our zero emission bus initiative. I highly recommend you check it out. And my email address is mschulz@septa.org. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Megan. Appreciate it. We're very excited to talk to you some more once we get through our panelist talks, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. So I definitely invite folks that do have questions for Megan to put them in the chat, and we will get to all of those in just a little bit. So now I want to turn over to another important public space that has been heavily impacted by plastic and waste, which is our waterways. As we talked about before, there are now microplastics everywhere, and that does include in our water systems. And while we can't see them, they are literally everywhere. So I think our next speaker, Jake Bransky, can attest to this better than I can. And I actually realized that I had forgotten to put up my slides before. So I'm going to go back to doing that. Give me 1 second. All right, so now we're going to turn things over to Jake. So Jake is an aquatic biologist at the Delaware River Basin Commission. And in his role, he does field monitoring, data analysis, and reporting related to water quality in the Delaware River Basin. And so earlier this year in January, Jake actually completed a study of microplastics, which was entitled Delaware Estuary Microplastics Monitoring and Cleanup. And I'll let him go through kind of the ins and outs of how he did his study and what he came to. But I think, one of the big conclusions of that study was just how widespread plastics were in every kind of space that they were looking at, in every waterway that they were looking at. And so, I think that just tells us all like how big of a problem this is and how it's growing, and something that we all really need to pay attention to. But with that, I do want to turn it over to Jake to tell us some more.
Thanks, Kim. Let me share my screen here. All righty. Thanks a lot. My name is Jake Bransky. I'm an aquatic biologist at the Delaware River Basin Commission. And as Kim mentioned today, I'm going to talk about a recent microplastic study that we undertook in the urban portion of the Delaware River estuary. I'll give a brief background on DRBC for those who are unfamiliar. We are a federal interstate agency founded in 1961. We have 5 equal members. Those are the states of Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, and also a representative from the federal government. 2 large cities, New York City and Philadelphia, are not official members, but they are advisors to the commission. We have several functional responsibilities as a federal interstate agency. Those are water quality, water supply, drought management, flood loss reduction, watershed planning, regulatory review and permitting, outreach and education, and recreation. 2 of those big core responsibilities for us are water quantity. So making sure there's enough water in the Delaware River for people. You know, the Delaware River is a large drinking water source for many people, both within the basin and without of the basin in New York City. And also making sure that that water is clean and healthy on the water quality side of things. And that's where I work. I do a lot of different water quality work for the Delaware River Basin Commission, everything from monitoring fish and bugs in the river to dissolved oxygen, chloride, and things of that nature, to toxic chemicals and things like microplastics that I'm going to be talking about here today. So a little background, I think most people are familiar with this at this point, but what are microplastics? They're defined as small pieces of plastic less than 5 millimeters in size, or about the size of a sesame seed and smaller. There's different types of microplastics. You have primary microplastics, which are microplastics that are produced at that small size, things like microfibers for clothing or microbeads that used to be used in personal care products and face washes and toothpastes, things like that. You also have secondary microplastics that come from the breakdown of larger particles of larger plastics like plastic bags or bottles or tires, things like that. So how do we study microplastics? There's a lot of different ways microplastics can be studied. They all kind of have their advantages and disadvantages depending on what type of plastic you're trying to sample. So this study for us was very much a pilot study. So we wanted to deploy a few different methods and see how the different methodologies affected the types of plastics we were collecting and the amounts of plastics we were collecting. So one method we used was a net sampler, as you see at the top here. It's basically a floating mesh net. It's a net that's usually used to sample plankton and small fish, but we repurposed it to sample plastic, and we attached some floats to it. So it sat right on the surface and it skimmed the water as it flowed down the stream, flowed through the net. It's a great method. It allows you to sample a really high volume of water. You can leave it out there all day and let it fill up. The downside is it is a net. It does have very tiny holes, so that smallest portion of those microplastics are going to flow through, so you're not going to catch those really fine particles. The bottom left here, we have a simple grab sampler. It's basically just a glass jar in a weighted container that we lower down into the stream off of a bridge to fill up with water, and then we take it back to the lab and filter it and process the sample back at the lab. This is a great sampling method because you don't need a boat. You don't have to get out in the water. You can just go to a bridge, dip it down, and move on. You can cover a lot of ground with this methodology. The main downside here being the volume. You just can't sample the same volume when you're filling up glass jars as when you're actively filtering through a net in the field. The final method we used was it's called a Niskin sampler. This is a version of a grab sampler, but it allows us to sample at different levels in the water column. So we used this method out in the river, out in the main shipping channel of the Delaware River, where we wanted to collect a sample at the surface and then 50 feet down at the bottom to see if there were differences in plastic concentrations, top versus bottom. So once you have the sample collected, what do you do with it? And there's several steps that need to be taken. So you have to first filter the sample, which we did with these set of gold soil sieves that you see in the middle here. Basically, this will filter out all the particles by size, so you know how many particles you have in each size grouping. You then have to remove the sediment because you get a lot of stuff other than plastic in these samples when you're out there. You get sediment, you get wood, you get grass, you get all sorts of junk in there. So you got to get the sediment out. And we used a process called density separation for that, where you basically make a salty solution and you pour your sample in it, and then the plastic floats to the top and the sediment sinks to the bottom, and you can isolate the plastic that way. And finally, you've got the organic matter, your leaves and aquatic vegetation in there. Basically, you run hydrogen peroxide through the sample that breaks down that organic matter, but leaves the plastic behind. So you can get that isolated sample to take into the lab to do more analysis on, which I'll talk about next. So that analysis that you do on those individual plastic particles can range from very simple to very complex. You can do things just as simple as looking under a microscope and saying, hey, that looks like plastic. I think that's a plastic particle. You can also do, on the simple side, a hot needle test where you heat up a needle and poke it. And if that particle melts, then it's probably plastic. If it doesn't, it's probably not. You can get really complex with things. We kind of were in the middle. We used what's called FTIR spectroscopy. An example of this can be seen in the picture here, where you put each plastic particle under this FTIR machine. It's a very tedious process for the technician who's going through these tiny little particles and picking them out of the sample and putting them under the microscope. The FTIR scans them and develops this spectrum that you can see in the image here, and it then matches the spectrum from your sample to a known dictionary of spectrums for other types of plastic, and we'll come up with the closest match for that particle. So in the example here, the bottom line is the line from our sample. The top line is the known spectrum for high density polyethylene. And you can see where the peaks and valleys are in these curves. They're very good matches, so that there's a 95% chance that that particle we found was high density polyethylene. So a little bit more about, our actual study. Where did we sample? What were our goals of the study? We set out to sample in the urban portion of the Delaware River estuary. Some other groups had already done work up in the non-tidal river, up from Washington's crossing all the way up to the New York border, and then down in the Bay as well. Another group had done some work. So we wanted to kind of fill in that gap between those two groups. So we sampled 4 or 5 sites in the main stem Delaware River, and then 9 tributaries, basically ranging from roughly Trenton, New Jersey, down to Wilmington, Delaware, that range. We used the combination of samplers, as I mentioned, and determined the chemical composition of the plastics using FTIR spectroscopy. And the goal of this project was that the data would inform models that would allow us to identify high plastic loading tributaries, which would then be targeted for cleanup efforts with partner organizations. I will mention that this all happened during COVID, so it was a bit of a mess getting this all done, and we kind of had to go in a couple of different directions, but ultimately we got there. I'll briefly go into some results here. There's a lot of numbers and figures here, but I'm just going to talk about some general patterns in these graphs. I will link our study report later, where there's a lot more results that we can get into. So first, plastic concentrations. As we expected, we found plastic everywhere in every sample that we collected. Grab samplers up here on the top panel of this chart, we see plastic everywhere. At the bottom panel are the net samples. The reason we see some samples without plastic here is not because they weren't there, it's because we didn't collect them. We only collected the net samples at a subset of the grab sample location. So basically, everywhere we went, we found plastic. We found a lot more plastic using the grab sampling method than the net sampling method, which does make sense though, because we, that net's going to allow some of those smaller particles to pass through. And when we look at the types of plastic we found it goes along with that same idea here. As we look at these are the shapes of the plastics that we found. The top chunk of samples here are all the grab samples we took. The bottom chunk are the net samples we took. The big thing I'd point out here is that the vast majority of these green bars that are making up 90 to 100% of the grab samples are fibers. And these are polyester nylon fibers that we're finding in the samples, most likely coming from clothes. You wear your fleece sweater and you put it in the washing machine, and some of those plastic fibers are getting released into the water system, and they're so small and fine, they're getting all the way through the water system, wastewater treatment plants and all that, and ending up back out into the river. So that was a very brief overview of the results. Like I said, there's a lot more on the shape, the size, the color, the composition of the plastics we found at all the different sites. We also have a web mapper that shows the results, breaks down all the results we found. It looks like this. I've got a link to it at the end of this. I can also post it in the chat as well for everybody. So lastly, how can we help? I think a lot of these things everyone here knows already. Reduce the plastic waste, use refillable coffee mugs, refillable water bottles, etc. Participate in volunteer cleanup efforts in your local watershed. As I mentioned, as part of this PROUD project, we isolated a couple areas where we thought plastic concentrations were very high. One of those being the Frankfurt Creek watershed in urbanized Philadelphia. So we did a cleanup effort with TTF in that watershed and removed a bunch of trash from the riparian area along the Frankfurt Creek. And we also did a cleanup along the main stem of the Delaware in the urbanized portion, basically at the base of the Tacony-Palmyra Bridge with Palmyra Cove Nature Center. Also, again, plenty of trash there that we were able to remove from the shores of the Delaware River. Finally, if you want to get more involved with DRBC, we're a government agency, so opportunities to get involved are a little more limited than some of these advocacy groups, but feel free to sign up for our DRBC social media accounts or emails. And again, we're a government agency, so a lot of our meetings are public, so feel free to attend and give us your feedback. And that's all I've got. Any questions, feel free to reach out to me tonight, or my email's on the screen here. I can add that into the chat as well, along with the links to the study. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jake. We really appreciated you going through that. I definitely couldn't have done that myself. So glad you were explaining that to us in detail and with the graphs. That was really helpful. And also, again, very scary to see kind of how pervasive these microplastics are in all of our waterways. So I want to take this moment to bring all three of you back on to take some Q&A from the audience. Excellent. So I think, let's see, I also want to bring Chris. Perfect. Great. A big thank you to all three of you again for being here with us. I think we got a flavor of like the different aspects of waste and plastic pollution and kind of what we can do and what different organizations and people already are doing, which is exciting to see. I would love to hear, from each of you, if you can, just kind of in the work that you've done and like what you've learned and seen, like is there anything that you find like incredibly frustrating that you think, this would be fairly quick and easy if we could fix this or like focus on this, if we had the resources and time, obviously. But is there something that like comes top of mind to you that like, you're like, I wish I could fix this one thing? And I don't know, Megan, maybe I'll start with you.
Oh man.
Sorry.
I mean, I feel like this takes a minute or like an hour to
Yes, yeah.
Sure. I mean, it's not a quick fix, but it's simple to explain. It's prioritizing transit, or at the least giving it equal parity with individual cars.
Mm-hmm.
It's even in dense cities like Philadelphia, space for parking is sacred, even when it's not in anybody's interest to encourage private parking ownership. A parking permit is so cheap. It's cheaper than it was in 1960. That price has gone down, while the cost of transit has doubled and tripled. You're incentivizing the wrong things. So it's a really hard cultural change, but my wish list is to magically make all citizens of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania and their representatives appreciate public transit as much as they appreciate individual cars.
Yeah. And maybe I should just take a minute too. I mean, making this connection between, the work that you all are doing in terms of, supporting public transit. I think, it may not seem apparent, obviously, with our conversations around plastic, but, this connection between fossil fuels and, how we're, how the oil industries are really getting at this in so many different ways. And so like there are different ways that we can really tackle these issues. And that could be through public transportation. It could be through limiting plastics use, and all of these issues are really intertwined in a bigger conversation. And so I just wanted to make sure to take a second and make that connection for everybody. So no, thank you, Megan. And I definitely I try to take public transportation as often as I can. And I will admit that, when it gets colder, it gets a little bit harder. But I'm a huge advocate and proponent. And, part of the great thing about living in a city is like access to public transportation. And so, hopefully we can continue to push in that direction, and show that it does make economical sense, and it makes environmental sense to keep moving in that direction. Jake, I'll ask you, from everything you've seen, like, what do you kind of hope, that we would change?
Sure. I think at this point it's more research for now. The field of microplastic study, especially in the basin, is pretty young. There's only a few studies that have been completed, and I think we just really need more data. Even ours is very much a pilot study, not necessarily anything we could take any action on right now in terms of putting out any rules or regulations for plastics. And I think ultimately the goal would be to get to a place like kind of where, places like Los Angeles, and I think Baltimore, maybe they've actually, put criteria in their regulations to help prevent trash from entering the waterways. And I think we've got a long way to go to get there, but I think hopefully that would be the ultimate goal.
That's great. And then Christina, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with what Megan said about this being kind of a simple action, but not necessarily an easy action. Going back to the fact that disposability is often just the norm, I think, in our culture today. With that said, there is so much that is just completely unnecessary in terms of the items that are given to consumers on a daily basis, whether or not they opt into it. So things like making sure that restaurants are serving you food on actual plates with actual silverware, that they're not just giving you kind of a whole bunch of ketchup packets and soy sauce packets in your takeout orders, that you have to ask for a straw instead of having, one be given to you with your drink. That's kind of a micro change in the grand scheme of things, but it really does go a huge way. And actually, there's research from an organization called Upstream, which I really recommend that you all check out too, about kind of the economic benefits of reuse being the norm, especially for restaurants. It might seem like it's expensive to buy a whole bunch of plates and forks and things of that nature, but it turns out it saves businesses money 100% of the time when they switch away from disposables over to reusable materials. So that's like a very easy, switch that makes not only environmental and health sense, but also economic sense.
Yeah, no, really helpful. And I think like thinking about what you and Jake just said, and kind of putting those together and just the push for more research that like connects this like invasion of plastic into every space and what the impacts of that are. I think the more that we can make those connections and the more research we have behind that kind of help propels the, the types of action, hopefully that you're talking about, Christina, and that creates more of kind of momentum for people to kind of ask for those things, right? Because I think once we start seeing the impacts on the environment, on our health, like, all of those things, and that we have the research to kind of back those things up, I think we're going to see more and more calls for action, by everyday people, that are in those spaces. And so hopefully we do get more funding for research and, and more research happening in that space to kind of promote that type of action.
Can I jump back in for a second?
Yeah, please.
I think another way to put a common thread between all those things is in economic terms, putting the incentive in the right place. Yes. And what's the word, like internalizing external costs, environmental costs. I mean, that's common to all environmental work, I think. But so I mentioned like the cost of parking is too low. It doesn't reflect the true cost of parking. And when it comes to disposables, I remember a story I heard a couple of years ago about, I think, Hong Kong or Singapore, and how the fees for residents to recycle versus throw things away were completely different, and so put the economic incentive to recycle. So that is a policy decision, and that depends on elected representatives, but that's a common thread to all environmental improvement on a large scale.
No, I think you're totally right, Megan. And the more that we can push our elected officials and others to and businesses and, kind of across the stream, but, especially starting at that kind of elected official end of like, how do we push them to start making environmental issues part of that criteria? Kind of when they're making decisions, right? Like making sure we're taking those costs, into the conversation when we're talking about the full impact of any of our decisions. I think it's so important, and not taken into account often enough. But hopefully we'll see that change. I think it's exciting to see legislation, being put forward and more attention being brought, at the national and international level. I think that's really exciting. Christina, on that note, we actually had one of our attendees ask a little bit more about the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. What's included in there and what can they do to help generate support for that in Congress?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of what to do to generate support in Congress, I'll maybe start there just because we are in a little bit of a limbo stage. Congress is kind of wrapping up right now, the current Congress, and a new one is coming in. And so in order for there to be movement on that bill, it would have to be reintroduced in the next session. So any sort of advocacy efforts would kind of have to wait until that happens. I can put a link in the chat to go through exactly what the bill includes. There are a handful of programs that are included in it, like support for reuse and refill programs, kind of pilot in that areas. It also includes things like a moratorium on new petrochemical build out for a period of time before there's, or after which point, until the point at which there's a study conducted on kind of the impacts of that industry. There's also greater incentives for recycling. It addresses some of the toxins that are present in plastic and creates some standards to try to, get those out of there. And then also ban certain single-use products too. So there's probably a handful, probably about like 10 or so actions that in full the act supports. And I will drop a summary for the bill in the chat so that you can read through the entire thing and get a better sense of exactly all the provisions that are in it.
That's great. Thank you. Really helpful. And then I'm going to kind of veer over and ask Megan, we have a question for you in terms of, I know you mentioned I think you mentioned the electric buses. And so someone wanted to know a bit more about where SEPTA is in terms of investing in electric buses. And then also a question around using potentially smaller vehicles during off-peak hours to save on fuel.
Okay, yeah, I could speak a little bit about our Zero Emission Bus Initiative. Our Zero Emission Bus Playbook is available on planning.septa.org, which I linked in the chat. So like all of our peers, we are investigating and actively plan to transition to a zero emission fleet. That is the future for sure. It is very complicated, more than I thought. I mean, you think from the outside, okay, just buy electric buses and use them instead of the diesel buses. But it's completely different, and the demands on the system are different, whether it is a battery electric bus or a hydrogen fuel cell bus, both of which are zero emission tailpipe, but have life cycle emissions depending on how you get your electricity and how you generate your hydrogen. In a nutshell, the big drawback for battery electric buses is that they do not have the range to do the service that our buses do. Our buses do blocks of service that are 100 or 200 miles. And there is no battery electric bus on the market that can do that reliably in all weather without on-route charging. And that's an order of magnitude more difficult because SEPTA does not own land on which we can put on-route chargers, and the drivers are not certified to be fuelers, et cetera. The big drawback to hydrogen is there just isn't that much of it yet. It's not a fuel that's available like diesel and gasoline is. You can get it, but it's mostly made by stripping the hydrogen atoms off of natural gas, which defeats the purpose of a renewable transportation. So that was a long way of saying we are working on it. Believe me, we are working on it. Our Proterra battery electric buses are currently out of service, but we are actively working with Proterra to bring them back online. I do not have a timeline for that. The lawyers are involved, but both of us want this to work. We are actually starting a pilot of hydrogen buses at our Midvale depot. That just started. We got an FTA low no emission grant for 10 buses. So the earliest they'll be on the road is in mid 2024. But of course, you need to build facilities for this. You need to source the buses. You need to train the operators and the maintenance. So I know it's frustrating. It seems like SEPTA works slowly, but it's a giant effort just to get a pilot, let alone convert our fleet of 1,400 revenue vehicles. So we're min-maxing it all and trying to figure out the best way we can transition while, as I said, if we don't deliver reliable service, we have failed. So we have to keep our riders in mind and our operators in mind and make sure the transition is smooth and we can continue to provide our core service, which is ridership, to promote regional sustainability.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And I think there was like a follow, I don't know if you answered this in there, but like there was a follow-up question just on using smaller vehicles during off-peak hours as well.
Sure. That's an interesting idea. It doesn't really make sense because if we have more vehicles, we need more space. And SEPTA has 8 bus depots, many of which are 100 years old, many of which are in the middle of residential areas in a city block with not an inch to spare. So we park buses on the street, literally. We don't have room for it in the yard. So as far as keeping like a double fleet of vehicles, on balance, it's not worth it. But that is the kind of like outside of the box thinking that we have to consider if we want to be able to keep providing service but minimizing our resources.
Yeah, no, it's a super interesting idea. I'm also like imagining the uproar about like using space in any neighborhood for that.
Right.
But like, I mean, I agree. Like, you know, how do we get creative about these questions, you know, and think outside the box as we start moving things forward. Thank you for answering both of those. I want to move it back over. I know like I'm kind of all over the place, so thank you all for bearing with me. But you're all doing really interesting and great work, and I want to touch upon all of it. So Jake, we had a couple of questions for you, one of which was someone asked that they saw that the Cooper River scored high in one of the categories in your study and just wanted you to kind of talk more about that and what the issues were there.
Sure, yeah, I think that's a combination of a couple of things there. One, the Cooper River where we sampled is very urbanized in downtown Camden. So just more plastic around. But I think the bigger issue there was that we sampled after a pretty big rain event. So I think there was a lot of plastic that got washed into the river ahead of our sampling. You know, ideally we would have taken samples under the exact same environmental conditions every time, but the real world didn't allow for that. So I think the higher flows in the river probably caused that higher reading for the Cooper.
Do you, and I don't know if this is like a question for you or maybe Christina also, just in terms of like microplastics overall, like where do you think we tend to see, like where are most microplastics found? Do you all have a sense of that?
In terms of like water versus,
Yeah, I mean, so that was the question. I mean, I guess I'm interested. I mean, like when you're looking in your space, like, you know, thinking about like, are there places where you expect to see it versus places where you were surprised to find that?
I mean, we found it everywhere. So
Yeah.
and we kind of expected to find it everywhere. You know, being in an urban estuary, but even so, USGS did the study in the non-tidal river, and they found it everywhere, even in some of the more pristine locations. You know, way upstream. So, you know, it's everywhere. We tried to do some modeling work with this data to kind of predict if there were going to be kind of hot spots where it would congregate in the estuary based on the tidal cycle and things of that nature. We didn't see a lot of that in the preliminary research we did. We saw that it kind of got flushed out pretty quickly, and then, you know, it congregates out in the ocean. Outside of our jurisdiction, but not good either.
Yeah.
And just to hop in on that point, yeah, I think this was kind of evident from Jake's presentation, but microplastics are really very harrowingly basically everywhere. There have been some really studies that were surprising to me, for instance, that showed that microplastics are also found kind of floating around in the air in some of the most remote national parks in the country. And you would think that that's not really a place where microplastics would be, given they're not near civilization at all. But I put this in the chat too, that's actually from car tires. So there's another connection between promoting public transit and a turn away from individual passenger vehicles too, because they do really end up everywhere. In terms of where humans come into the most contact with microplastics, it's in air, water, and food. And especially if you're drinking bottled water, that is a much greater source of microplastics entering your body. So another great reason to kind of go toward tap water and really underscores the importance of like clean and reliably safe drinking water as well for people too. So yeah, they're kind of unavoidable, really scarily.
Yes.
I'll also jump in quickly and add that them being in air makes our job very difficult because, we're processing these samples indoors where we're assuming there's no plastics, but really they're everywhere. And, some of these plastics we might be seeing could be being contamination while we're analyzing the sample in the lab.
Yeah,
So it gets tricky.
Yeah. No, I feel like, again, as you said, lots more research needed. And unfortunately, like, I don't think there's going to be a lack of need for that. So I think we're going to continue to hopefully see more research happening in that space as well. Is there anyone here that can kind of touch upon this issue of like microplastics and health? I think, there's still like some of the research is still fairly new in that space, but there has been some like concerning research kind of coming abroad about that. So I don't know, Christina, if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge concern and a really big topic that I could spend a lot of time addressing. I think the research is still pretty cutting edge in terms of the long-term health impacts of microplastics. From my introduction, you're already seeing that we're seeing microplastics in things like placentas and breast milk. And so we're finding that I think also a study earlier this year found microplastics in the deepest part of human lung tissue as well, due to exposure in the air. So we definitely know that they're in our bodies. Kind of the largest question in the research right now is whether they can cross the barrier between our bloodstream and our brain. That's called the blood-brain barrier. There's research in a fish species showing that microplastics are able to do that, but research has not necessarily demonstrated that ability in humans yet. So that would be a really big frontier of understanding in terms of microplastics health impacts, to see really how embedded they can become in our bodies, and really what the long-term impacts of that are. But plastics themselves have a lot of other chemicals kind of involved in them that give them their elasticity, features, or the rigidity and certain colorants and other features of the plastics. And a lot of those chemicals are what are called endocrine disrupting chemicals. And so they kind of interfere with your body's hormone system, and they can lead toward things like, thyroid disease, obesity, developmental disorders, various types of cancers. And so there's a lot of potentially really scary impacts of microplastics because of the endocrine disrupting components of plastics, as well as the additives that are in them. But the health side of things definitely does warrant more research. New research is coming out all of the time. And I'm sure that, the next year I can't predict what we might know in the next year, but I'm sure that we'll be in a very different space, even just within, a few months' time than we are now in terms of our understanding of the way that they impact our health in the long term.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that's really helpful. And, I do think the same, just the more we hear about that, I think that'll actually push change at a faster speed than I think a lot of other things might. So that'll be interesting. Thank you all for being with us. I do want to make sure we have one more segment of our program tonight that I do want to get to, but I want to, one, thank you all, and two, I do want to know, there were more questions in the chat than we could get to. I do want to let everyone know, yes, there can be frustration when there's, a public transit system. And so I think Megan acknowledges that as well. But I also, one of the things she said tonight, which I think, we should really take away, is like, it is a public transit system. And in that is like a very good thing to have. And so I think the more that we can try to push for positive change and, really encourage that and encourage others to invest in that, I think the better off we'll all be. And I'm personally excited to know that someone like Megan is doing that, and that we have environmental engineers that are focusing on these issues and thinking about these issues. So thank you, Megan, for being with us and for, doing the work that you do. And we'll encourage more people to use public transportation, as possible. And Jake and Christina, thank you so much for, for all the information you just provided about microplastics. Hopefully we've given all of our attendees a good overview of the scale of the issues around plastic pollution and really waste overall. And so now what we want to do is think, about the fact that we are in the midst of the holiday season. And we want to add that, during the time between now, between Thanksgiving and New Year's, unfortunately, waste in the US actually increases by 25%. And a lot of that, unfortunately, is plastic pollution. So considering how high waste is normally in the country, that's a really scary statistic to me. So I fully acknowledge how hard it is to move away from creating waste and plastic waste, and how much it is part of our daily life, especially during this time of year when we have all these get-togethers and pressure to give gifts, all along the way. So I know that that can be really challenging, but worry not. There are ways in which we can all do better, and that we can inspire others in our lives to do better. So to help lead us in that conversation, we invited Emily Rodia, the co-founder of Goodbye Supply, to join us tonight. And for those that aren't familiar with it, Goodbye Supply is Philly's first retail store dedicated to plastic-free alternatives for everyday life. Located on East Passyunk Avenue, Goodbye Supply has an awesome supply and selection of reusables and refillables to live your environmentally free or environmentally friendly life. So Emily came to this after trying to live a more zero waste, plastic free lifestyle with her partner, Jason, and being in Philadelphia, they found that to be fairly challenging at the time. I think they were looking to reduce their footprint and didn't have a lot of options. So instead of just throwing their hands up and giving up, the two of them decided to open their own store. And so in November 2020, they opened up Goodbye Supply, and we invited Emily here tonight to give us some tips and suggestions on how we might reduce our waste during the holiday season and beyond. So hopefully taking all of the information that you just learned and trying to think of ways, that you can do better this holiday season and inspire others, beyond just, taking the bus and not driving everywhere. So here are some other tips and tricks from Emily. Thanks so much for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kim. If you guys don't know me or didn't hear my name's Emily, and I am the co-founder of Goodbye Supply. We are Philly's first retail store dedicated to a plastic-free world, and we're located on East Passyunk. So, I came to just kind of show you a few tips and tricks to lighten the mood about the holiday spirit and not feel so terrible about the waste that you might come across this year. One of my favorite things to do to eliminate some gift wrapping you might come across is wrapping in fabric. So this technique is actually called furoshiki. It's a Japanese wrapping technique using fabric, which is super cool because you can make that part of the gift. This is actually a little tea towel that I've wrapped here. It's a really fun way to reuse materials that maybe you come across in your life. Maybe it's an old shirt or something else. You could even use things like a grocery bag or newspaper, something compostable like twine is a really good alternative to regular gift wrap. Most gift wrap that's in the store is either covered in like a plastic foil or something else that's blended with the paper, making it not recyclable, or covered in glitter, which is the worst kind of plastic I like to see. So another favorite thing of mine to wrap gifts is using a jar. So you could even use something like a pickle jar or whatever you have lying around and fill it with little odds and ends that you plan on gifting to someone. Could be food related, could be, this one's a little hygiene kit of things that they might use throughout the year. But I have a couple suggestions as far as parameters I like to do for the holiday season with my friends and family. We tend to try and gift experiences to each other, like going to the museums. There's plenty of great ones in Philly that you can bring a loved one to. That would be super exciting and no waste, and you're supporting our museums here. I also love to gift food items to people, something they can eat and not have so much waste involved. That can be like a homemade jam or anything else. I actually made hot sauce for all of my friends this year using some peppers from the co-op up the street. Really simple and really affordable as well. So homemade gifts to me personally are some of the best gifts. If you do want to purchase something, I always recommend shopping local and finding something reusable and something that has minimal holiday decor on it. Most holiday items that are manufactured aren't that good quality. They're just meant for you to grab them and buy them during the season where impulse buying is like out of control. So I have some suggestions that I brought here that are good for any time of year, not just Christmas or Hanukkah or any other celebration. And a lot of these actually touch back to a pre-plastic world. Like Christina said in the beginning, plastic didn't really become mainstream until the 50s. So some of these things that I'm going to show were existing before plastic. So first one I have is a little like shave set. So there's a solid shave soap in there. And then the old-fashioned safety razors, which are fully stainless steel pieces that someone could use forever. I also have, this is one of my favorite things that's been very popular this year, the vintage style ice trays. So basically you would put your water in here, freeze it, and then you lift this lever and it cracks the ice. So a lot of people come in the shop and they're like, I had that growing up. I love those, but they're making a comeback, as are a lot of these plastic-free options. So even things like the popular unpaper towels, really, it's just people were using rags or old shirts or just tea towels all the time. Paper towels weren't something that we were using. So this is just a version of the rag. And then what else do I have here? Oh, this one's exciting. So this is solid dish soap, which is super cool. It eliminates the bottle completely. It's just a big chunk of soap, and you take a little scrub brush, scrub it on there, and you have your dish soap. Just wash your dishes like normal. So think of it like a body bar of soap, but for your dishes. So same exact concept. Most people used to use that instead of the liquid stuff, and the liquid stuff is mostly water. So yeah. So I just saw this question pop up in the chat. One of these bars is equivalent to like 3 bottles of dish soap. So in my house, we don't have a dishwasher, so I just hand wash dishes. It lasts about 3 to 4 months. So quite a while. It's just me and my husband, so that's my people to bar ratio. But yeah, basically, don't stress about the holidays. If you can get something for someone, think simply, don't overdo it. I'd like to do rules and just less things for the holiday season, at least with my friends and family. But anyway, I'll let you guys enjoy the rest of your evening, but I'm going to link our website in the chat in case you want to purchase anything from us, but no pressure.
No, that's super helpful. Thanks, Emily. And yes, I would also add to that list. You all have some great, I think you had like bath salts, which who doesn't want bath salts, you know, as a lovely gift. And you can bring your own container, your own jar, and, you know, fill up and put some, you know, bath salts. I think at one point you had like flower seeds, you know, like there are just some lovely, you know, stocking stuffers or, you know, other gifts that you can add that people can use, you know, and don't just like sit in someone's house, which I think is great. And, you know, I would say like all the things you mentioned, what's great about them is like people can use them. You know, it's not just something like that's going to sit on someone's, you know, table or desk or under their bed for years to come. So no, we appreciate that. And I was actually just gonna pull up the picture we have of your store so that everyone can see just how lovely it is. So we do, you know, encourage you to go and visit the store if you can, chat with Emily and her partner, Jason, and, you know, kind of talk to them about, you know, what they've done kind of in their own lives to kind of shift their lifestyle. And, you know, I think one of the other things just to start with is just buying, you know, if you have to buy something and you know, you really are thinking about buying something, like try to buy something that someone needs or wants. rather than just something that's gonna, kind of sit somewhere and not get used. But I loved, Emily, how you started off with like, think about experiences. And I think there's so many great ideas out there, there's the museums. I was telling, someone like, get someone a massage. Who doesn't need a massage? So there's lots of great ways to support local businesses, and, not add to the waste this holiday season. But I want to thank you for joining us. And I also want to thank again, all of the other speakers that we had tonight. This was such a fantastic conversation, and really touching upon both like the challenges and the issues, and then going all the way over to kind of what are big organizations doing in the space and what has happened in terms of positive changes, and then what can we do in our own life. And I think all of those are important. I often hear, the conversation around like, personal action doesn't matter, or, all we need is like policy change. And I am a firm believer that we need both. And so we really need kind of that bigger change, and we need to drive change in our own lives, right? Like, if we all want to see that happen, then how do we do that together? So I do encourage you all to continue this conversation through the holidays with those that you love, and, see how you can kind of create a community around that with each other. And with that, I want to thank you for attending tonight. We've had such a great time speaking with all of you, and thank you for all the questions that came in through the chat. We will do our best to send some information out with our follow-up email to try to address some of those questions and send you more resources and information. And we would like to ask you to save the date for our next program, which will be in February. We would also love to hear from you if you have any thoughts on our programs, or if you're interested in, in the organizations that run Philly Talks Trash. We're happy to connect with you. So please feel free to email us. And then lastly, if you're interested in joining either the Plastics Reduction Task Force or the Philadelphia Neighborhood Networks, we have our contact information here and would love to hear from you that way. So thank you all so much. We want to wish you happy holidays, and hope to see you all soon.